The rain fell in sheets against the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle, a persistent drumbeat that had become the soundtrack to the quiet corridors of power in the weeks following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. For Warrant Officer Class 1, Thomas Vance, the steady rhythm was a familiar comfort. He was a man carved from the same granite as the castle itself, a 42-year-old veteran of the Coldstream Guards with a back as straight as a ramrod and a meticulously trimmed gray mustache that spoke of decades spent in service to the crown. His world was one of order, precision, and unshakable protocol. He had stood guard through terrorist threats, state banquets, and the ever-present flash of paparazzi cameras. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for the discovery that lay hidden behind a seemingly innocent steel door. Ade Thomas had been assigned to the royal household for nearly 8 years, his primary duty the oversight of the Windsor Castle security detail. He knew every portrait, every creaking floorboard, and every shadow that fell across the quadrangles. He was a ghost in the halls, a silent sentinel whose presence was as constant as the castle itself. In the frantic, grief-stricken months after the Queen's passing, the palace had been a whirlwind of activity. Staff moved with a hushed urgency, sorting through a lifetime of possessions, preparing for the accession of King Charles III, and managing the complex machinery of a centuries-old institution in mourning. It was during this period of transition that Thomas first noticed the discrepancies. They were small, almost insignificant at first. On a request for a security escort to a particular storage wing that wasn't on the official schedule. A late-night entry logged in the electronic system by a senior aide, citing a vague reason of inventory management. His instincts, honed over a lifetime, began to prickle. The unease settled deep in his bones, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. He began to watch more closely, to review access logs with a finer-tooth comb. He noticed a pattern. The Queen Consort's private secretary, a man named Alistair Finch, had been making frequent unaccompanied trips to a section of the Royal Archives that was officially listed as being in long-term conservation. It was a dusty, forgotten area, a place where one would not expect the bustling office of the new Queen's right-hand man to have any business. And Thomas's suspicions were not about Camilla personally. He was not a man for gossip or palace intrigue. His loyalty was to the institution, to the crown, and to the unbroken line of service that connected him to guardsmen who had stood watch over the Tudors and the Stuarts. It was this loyalty that compelled him to act. One damp Tuesday evening, his opportunity arrived. He received a notification that a silent alarm had been triggered in that very section of the archives. It was not a blaring siren, but a soft digital alert on his tablet. Someone had accessed the zone without logging out properly. Thomas Vance made a decision. Instead of dispatching a junior officer, he decided to investigate personally. He pulled on his heavy wool greatcoat, the brass buttons catching the dim light. Yes, and made his way through the winding stone passages of the castle. The air grew colder and stiller as he descended a narrow spiral staircase into a part of the castle he had rarely visited. The walls here were of rough-hewn stone, and the only sound was the echo of his own boots. He came to a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. This was it. The door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he found himself in a small, vaulted chamber. It was a room forgotten by time. Dust sheets covered bulky pieces of furniture, and ancient deed boxes were stacked against the walls. But his eyes were drawn to the back of the room, where a modern, sleek steel vault door stood in stark contrast to the ancient surroundings. It was new, and it was humming with power, and it was open. Through the gap, he could see Alistair Finch, and the man's back was to him, his shoulders hunched as he carefully lifted a stunning diamond and sapphire pendant from a velvet-lined case. The jewel seemed to glow with an inner fire, even in the low light of the vault. But what made Thomas's blood run cold was the look on Finch's face, not of reverence, but of acquisitive satisfaction. It was the look of a man claiming a prize. As Thomas watched, frozen in the doorway, Finch placed the pendant in a simple leather bag, zipped it shut, and turned to leave. Their eyes met. For a split second, panic flashed across Finch's face, quickly masked by a practiced, haughty glare. "Warrant officer," he said, his voice tight, "you were not announced. The Queen Consort's business is not your concern." Thomas's voice was calm, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "With respect, sir, as this area is not on any authorized access list for tonight. May I ask what you are removing?" Finch's eyes narrowed. "You may not. This is a matter of personal effect transfer for Her Majesty, Queen Camilla. Items being moved for her private collection. Now, if you'll excuse me." He brushed past Thomas, the leather bag clutched tightly under his arm. Thomas did not try to stop him. It was not his place to physically detain a senior royal aide. But as he watched Finch disappear into the shadows of the corridor, a cold, hard knot formed in his stomach. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that what he had just witnessed was not a simple transfer of property. It was a quiet, calculated removal. And he was one of the only people who knew about it. He stood alone in the silent, dusty chamber, and the faint scent of lavender and old paper in the air, and understood that he was now the keeper of a secret that could shake the very foundations of the House of Windsor. In the days that followed, Warrant Officer Vance became a man possessed. He could not let the image of that sapphire pendant go. It haunted him during his rounds, appearing in his mind's eye every time he closed his own. He began his own silent investigation, a shadow operation conducted in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. He had access to the master inventory of the royal collection, a vast leather-bound ledger and its digital counterpart that listed every painting, piece of furniture, and jewel owned by the sovereign in an official capacity. And he started cross-referencing this official list with the Queen's personal bequests, items she had explicitly left to specific family members in her will. It was painstaking, tedious work, made more difficult by the fact that the line between crown property and personal property was often deliberately blurred, a matter of trust and tradition rather than strict documentation. Then he found the key. Buried deep within a sealed appendix of the Queen's will, a document he was able to access only through his high-level security clearance and the help of a sympathetic elderly clerk in the Lord Chamberlain's office who remembered the Queen's explicit instructions, was a reference to something called the Legacy Archive. It was a separate, secret collection, locked away not for the crown, not for any single heir, but for posterity. The appendix listed a few items by name: the Lockridge pendant, the very sapphire he had seen, the Snowdon diamond tiara, and a simple leather-bound journal with no further description. These items, the Queen had decreed in a private codicil added in 2019, were not to be inherited. They were to remain sealed in a designated vault, accessible only with the approval of the monarch and the Prince of Wales acting together. Thomas felt a jolt of electricity. This was it. This was the proof he needed. The items in that vault were not Camilla's to claim. Alistair Finch, acting on someone's orders, was stripping the Queen's legacy. But who was he to tell? Going through official channels meant reporting to his superiors, men who answered to the King's household. He had no evidence of Camilla's direct involvement, only her aid. If he was wrong, his career was over, his honor shattered. He decided he needed more proof. He needed to see inside that vault again. His chance came 3 weeks later. Finch, perhaps overconfident after his first successful removal, had become careless. Thomas noticed a recurring pattern of Tuesday evening visits. On the following Tuesday, Thomas positioned himself in a disused chapel adjacent to the archive corridor. He waited, a silent statue in the darkness, for over 2 hours. Just after 10 p.m., he heard the faint click of the oak door. He gave Finch a 10-minute head start before silently moving into the corridor. Peering through the gap in the steel vault door, he saw Finch once again, this time carefully lifting the Snowden tiara. But this time, Finch wasn't alone. A woman stood with her back to the door, her silhouette unmistakable. It was Camilla, the queen consort. She was wearing a simple dark coat, her head slightly bowed as she looked at the glittering tiara in Finch's hands. "This one will be reset," she said, her voice low but clear in the silent vault. "The design is outdated. The diamonds can be used for a more modern piece. No one will ever know they came from this." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, calculated act. He watched as Camilla herself took the tiara, wrapped it in a silk cloth, and placed it into a larger travel case. They were not just moving items. They were planning to dismantle them, to erase their history. The Queen's final wishes, her sacred trust, were being broken right in front of him. He felt a surge of profound anger, a protective fury that overrode every instinct of self-preservation. As Camilla and Finch turned to leave, they found their path blocked. Thomas Vance stood in the doorway of the vault, his face a mask of stone, his eyes burning with quiet intensity. The queen consort stopped dead, her eyes widening in shock, a flicker of fear crossing her face before being replaced by a haughty indignation. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You forget your place, guard." Thomas did not move. He did not salute. He looked directly at her, then at the tiara in her hands. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of history. "With the greatest respect, I have not forgotten my place. My place is to serve the crown, and the crown's will was made clear by Queen Elizabeth. That tiara does not belong to you." For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. The only sound was the hum of the vault's climate control. Camilla's face drained of color. Finch looked as if he might be sick. In that single defiant act, Thomas Vance had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had challenged the queen consort. He had placed duty above his own safety. The secret war for the queen's legacy had just become a very public, very dangerous confrontation.